The 1970s changed Westerns forever. Directors stopped making heroes noble and villains clear. They showed the West as dirty, violent, and morally bankrupt. Audiences and critics weren't ready for it. These are 10 Westerns from the 70s that were considered too extreme. Number 10. The Hired Hand, 1971. Peter Fonda directed his first film and created something nobody expected, a Western that moved like a dream and ended in shocking violence. The Hired Hand follows two drifters who decide to settle down after years wandering. Fonda plays Harry Collings, returning to the wife he abandoned 7 years earlier. She takes him back, but only as a hired hand, not as a husband. It's a slow, meditative film about regret and second chances, right up until the final act when it becomes brutally violent. What made The Hired Hand extreme for 1971 wasn't just the violence, it was how Fonda filmed everything. He used slow dissolves, freeze frames, and overexposed imagery to create a dreamlike atmosphere that made the sudden bursts of violence even more jarring. People get shot, and the film lingers on their death, showing blood pooling and bodies convulsing. It's realistic in a way Westerns typically weren't, and audiences found it disturbing. The film also dealt frankly with sexuality and relationships in ways Westerns avoided. Fonda's character abandoned his wife and child for years of drifting. When he returns, she's understandably angry and makes him prove his commitment by working for her as an employee. There's emotional brutality in those scenes that's harder to watch than the physical violence. The power dynamic between them, with her holding all the cards and him accepting humiliation to earn forgiveness, made audiences uncomfortable. Critics didn't know what to make of it. Some praised Fonda's visual experimentation. Others thought the art film techniques didn't belong in a Western. The film bombed, making less than $1 million. Universal had no idea how to market a slow, meditative Western that suddenly turned violent. They barely promoted it and let it die in theaters. Fonda wouldn't direct another film for nearly 20 years. The ending is what really shocked audiences. Harry's friend gets captured by outlaws, and Harry goes to rescue him, knowing it's a suicide mission. The rescue turns into a massacre. Harry is shot multiple times, dying slowly while his friend escapes. The film ends with Harry's wife learning he's dead, and there's no consolation, no sense that his sacrifice meant anything. He died for nothing, trying to help a friend who probably wasn't worth dying for. That nihilism was too much for audiences expecting traditional Western heroics. The Hired Hand has been rediscovered in recent years, with critics praising its visual style and emotional honesty. But in 1971, it was too experimental and too bleak for mainstream success. Fonda's attempt to reinvent a Western aesthetic while maintaining genre elements confused audiences who wanted one or the other, not both. The film's extremity wasn't in graphic content, but in its refusal to provide easy answers or satisfying resolution. Number 9. Ulzana's Raid, 1972.
First Geronimo, then Cochise, and now the bloodiest Apache of them all.
Robert Aldrich directed the most unflinching depiction of Apache warfare and cavalry response ever filmed, and it was too brutal for most audiences. Ulzana's Raid follows a young cavalry officer and a veteran scout pursuing an Apache warrior who's escaped the reservation with a small band. The film shows atrocities committed by both sides, suggesting violence begets violence until everyone becomes monstrous. That moral ambiguity, combined with graphic depictions of torture, made it one of the most controversial Westerns of the decade. Burt Lancaster plays McIntosh, a scout who understands both Apache and cavalry perspectives and is appalled by both. He's the audience surrogate, a man trying to maintain moral clarity in a situation where survival requires constant compromise. Bruce Davison plays the young officer, an idealistic Christian who believes in treating enemies humanely. Watching his idealism get destroyed by reality is part of what made the film so uncomfortable. This wasn't entertainment. It was an education in how frontier violence corrupted everyone it touched. What made Ulzana's Raid extreme was Aldrich's commitment to showing what Apache raids actually involved. A woman is raped and murdered, while her husband is forced to watch. A soldier is staked out in the desert to die slowly in the sun. Bodies are mutilated in ways that serve Apache spiritual beliefs about preventing enemies from entering the afterlife whole. Aldrich doesn't sensationalize any of it. He films it matter-of-factly, which somehow makes it worse. This isn't exploitation, it's a horror documentary, but the film also shows cavalry atrocities. When they capture an Apache woman, the debate isn't about morality, but pragmatism. Should they cull her or let her go? Later, they massacre an Apache camp, culling women who weren't part of the raiding party. The parallel is unavoidable. Both sides commit atrocities. Both sides justify them. The cycle continues until everyone is dead or broken. That refusal to pick sides made audiences angry. They wanted clear heroes and villains. Aldrich gave them only victims and killers. The film was released during the final years of Vietnam, and the parallels were impossible to miss. Here was another story about a powerful military force hunting indigenous enemies through hostile terrain, finding conventional warfare ineffective, and resorting to increasingly brutal tactics. Critics recognized the subtext immediately. Some praised Aldrich for making a relevant political film. Others accused him of exploiting the Western genre to make anti-war propaganda. Either way, audiences stayed away. Ulzana's raid made barely $3 million, not enough to recoup its budget and marketing costs. The violence was too graphic for mainstream theaters, and the downbeat ending offered no catharsis. Everyone survives, but they're all damaged by what they've witnessed and done. Lancaster's final expression is pure exhaustion and disgust. He's seen this cycle before and knows it will continue. That hopelessness was too much for audiences who wanted westerns to provide escape, not mirror the horrors they saw on the news every night. Number 8. Bad Company, 1972.
If you're gonna pull a gun on somebody, you better fire it about a half a second after you do it.
Robert Benton directed this story about Civil War draft dodgers heading west, and it's one of the bleakest westerns ever made. Bad Company follows a group of young men fleeing the Union draft, who form a gang and discover they're not cut out for frontier life. They're not heroes or even competent outlaws. They're scared kids in over their heads, and the film watches them make bad decisions until most of them are dead. That nihilistic worldview made it too extreme for audiences expecting adventure. Jeff Bridges plays Jake, the closest thing the film has to a protagonist. He's a middle-class kid whose parents paid for his escape from the draft. He meets up with other Dodgers and they head west, planning to make their fortune. But none of them know what they're doing. They try to rob people, but can't go through with it. They befriend the wrong people and get betrayed. They starve because they don't know how to hunt or forage. The film systematically destroys every romantic notion about frontier life. What made Bad Company extreme wasn't graphic violence, though there's some. It was the casual cruelty in the sense that these kids never had a chance. They rob a Union soldier and beat him to death because they panic. They abandon a friend who gets sick because they can't afford to slow down. One character freezes to death because he gambled away his coat. Another gets shot by farmers he tried to rob. The deaths aren't heroic or meaningful. They're just stupid and wasteful, which is exactly Benton's point. The film also deals honestly with hunger and desperation. There are scenes of the boys eating grass and tree bark because they have no food. They're constantly cold, constantly scared, constantly making decisions that will probably cull them. This wasn't the romantic West of traditional Westerns. This was what the frontier actually looked like for poor, unprepared people. And it was miserable. Audiences didn't want to watch privileged kids suffer for 2 hours with no redemption at the end. The screenplay was written by Benton and David Newman, the team that wrote Bonnie and Clyde. They brought the same revisionist energy to Westerns that they had brought to gangster films. Bad Company was meant to comment on Vietnam, showing young men sent into situations they don't understand by leaders who don't care if they survive. The draft dodger angle made it even more controversial. Some critics accused the film of being unpatriotic, sympathizing with cowards who refused to serve. The film bombed, making just over $2 million. Paramount had no idea how to market a Western, where the protagonists were draft dodgers and most of them died. Critics were divided. Pauline Kael praised it as a masterpiece. Roger Ebert gave it 2 stars and called it too downbeat. Audiences mostly avoided it. The film has been reassessed over time and is now considered one of the best revisionist Westerns. But in 1972, it was too extreme in its cynicism and too honest about what frontier life meant for people without resources or skills. Number 7. The Great Northfield, Minnesota Raid, 1972.
Northfield.
Amen.
Philip Kaufman directed this revisionist take on the James Younger gang, stripping away every romantic notion and showing them as incompetent, paranoid criminals whose famous raid was a complete disaster. The Great Northfield, Minnesota raid was too extreme because it took American folk heroes and revealed them as delusional losers. Audiences weren't ready for Jesse James, played by Robert Duvall, to be portrayed as an unhinged sociopath who read dime novels about himself and believed his own mythology. The film follows the gang in their final days before the Northfield raid. They're falling apart. Cole Younger, played by Cliff Robertson, is tired and wants out. The gang members argue constantly. Jesse is convinced they're invincible because newspapers call them heroes. The film shows how celebrity and myth-making corrupted them, turning petty criminals into legends who believe their own press. When they finally attempt the Northfield raid, it's a comedy of errors that gets most of them killed or captured. What made the film extreme was Kaufman's deliberate demolition of Western mythology. He shot it almost like a documentary, using handheld cameras and natural lighting. The gang members look dirty and desperate, not noble. Their crimes are shown as brutal and pointless. There's a scene where they rob a bank and pistol whip a clerk for no reason, except Jesse is in a bad mood. These aren't Robin Hood figures stealing from the rich. They're violent thugs justifying their actions with self-serving rhetoric. The Northfield raid itself is chaotic. The gang rides into town thinking they'll be greeted as heroes. Instead, the townspeople fight back. Armed citizens open fire from windows. The gang panics and starts shooting wildly. People die on both sides. It's not a romantic last stand. It's a massacre where nobody wins and everyone looks stupid. Several gang members are cold. The rest flee in different directions. Jesse and Frank escape, but their gang is destroyed. The film suggests they were lucky, not skilled. Kaufman also showed the aftermath in brutal detail. The captured gang members are displayed in jail like zoo animals while tourists gawk. They're tried, convicted, and sent to prison where they'll spend the rest of their lives. There's no escape, no redemption, no sense that their outlaw lifestyle meant anything. They gambled and lost, and now they'll die in cages. That hopelessness made audiences uncomfortable. They wanted Jesse James to be a hero or at least go down fighting. Kaufman refused to give them that satisfaction. The film flopped badly. Universal expected a crowd-pleasing Western about famous outlaws. They got a cynical deconstruction that made the audience's heroes look pathetic. Critics were split between admiring Kaufman's revisionism and wishing he'd made something more entertaining. The film made barely $2 million and disappeared quickly. Kaufman's career survived, but it took years before he got another major project. The Great Northfield, Minnesota raid was too extreme in its contempt for Western mythology, and audiences punished it for refusing to lie. Number 6, Soldier Blue, 1970.
That old man is trading off rifles, selling guns.
Ralph Nelson directed the most controversial Western of the decade, a film about the Sand Creek Massacre that showed genocidal violence in graphic detail. Soldier Blue was considered too extreme, not just for its violence, but for its timing. Released during Vietnam, the film was a deliberate allegory about American atrocities, and the final 20 minutes remains some of the most disturbing sequences ever filmed in a Western. The film doesn't just suggest cavalry soldiers committed genocide, it shows exactly what that looked like, and audiences were horrified. The film stars Candice Bergen and Peter Strauss as survivors of a Cheyenne attack, who journey across hostile territory toward a cavalry fort. Most of the runtime is a survival story, with some social commentary about white treatment of Native Americans. Then the final act arrives, and the film becomes almost unwatchable. The cavalry attacks a peaceful Cheyenne village, and Nelson shows everything. Women and children are shot, stabbed, and mutilated. Pregnant women are culled. Soldiers cut off body parts as trophies. The violence is explicit and prolonged, designed to sicken audiences. Nelson based the massacre sequence on eyewitness accounts of the real Sand Creek Massacre in 1864, where Colorado militia killed over 150 Cheyenne and Arapaho, mostly women, children, and elderly. The real event was as brutal as what's shown, possibly worse. Nelson researched testimony from survivors and soldiers, and he recreated it as accurately as possible. That historical accuracy didn't make it easier to watch. If anything, knowing this actually happened made it more disturbing. The film was banned in Sweden and heavily censored across Europe. Even in America, many theaters refused to show it. Those that did faced protests. Veterans groups picketed, claiming the film portrayed American soldiers as war criminals. Anti-war activists praised it for showing what genocide actually looks like. The controversy overshadowed everything else about the film. Critics couldn't discuss the performances or cinematography without addressing the massacre sequence that dominated all conversation. What made Soldier Blue especially extreme was its explicitness. Previous westerns about Native American massacres either happened off-screen or were filmed tastefully. Nelson refused to look away. He shows children being murdered. He shows mutilation. He shows soldiers laughing while they call. The sequence runs nearly 15 minutes and feels longer because it's so relentless. There's no heroic intervention, no last-minute rescue, just systematic slaughter while Strauss's character watches helplessly, unable to stop it. Nelson defended the violence by pointing out this actually happened, and pretending otherwise serves no one. Americans committed genocide against Native peoples, and sanitizing that history allows people to forget or deny it. The sanitized westerns of previous decades had lied about frontier reality, turning massacres into heroic battles. Nelson wanted to correct that lie, even if it meant traumatizing audiences. The film made over $10 million, profitable but controversial. It's now recognized as an important corrective to decades of Hollywood mythology, but in 1970, it was simply too extreme for most viewers to handle. Number 5. A Man Called Horse, 1970.
Christ! I've had enough!
Elliot Silverstein directed this film about an English aristocrat captured by Sioux and integrated into their tribe, and it shocked audiences with its graphic depiction of the Sundance ceremony. A Man Called Horse was considered too extreme because it showed Native American rituals in unflinching detail, including a ceremony where the protagonist has wooden skewers pushed through his chest muscles and hangs suspended by rawhide thongs. The sequence is brutal, prolonged, and genuinely difficult to watch, even for audiences accustomed to Western violence. Richard Harris plays Lord John Morgan, captured by Sioux warriors and treated as property. The film follows his gradual acceptance into the tribe, learning their language and customs. Unlike most Westerns that simplified or romanticized Native cultures, A Man Called Horse attempted authenticity. Silverstein consulted with Native advisors, used Sioux language with subtitles, and insisted on showing ceremonies as they actually occurred. That commitment to realism is what made the Sundance sequence so shocking. This wasn't Hollywood fabrication. This was documentation of a real ritual practiced by Plains tribes. The Sundance ceremony is the film's centerpiece and its most controversial element. Morgan volunteers to participate to prove his commitment to the tribe. Wooden skewers are pushed through the skin and muscle of his chest. Rawhide thongs are tied to the skewers and attached to a pole. He must dance and pull against the thongs until his flesh tears free. The film shows all of it in graphic detail. Harris actually had prosthetics attached that allowed him to be partially suspended, making his pain and exhaustion genuine. The sequence runs over 10 minutes and is genuinely grueling to watch. What made this extreme wasn't just the graphic nature, but the cultural context. Previous Westerns treated Native rituals as savage or primitive. A Man Called Horse presented the Sundance as sacred and meaningful, a test of spiritual strength rather than barbarism. But showing it in such detail made white audiences uncomfortable. They weren't sure how to process Native spirituality presented without judgment or explanation. The film trusts viewers to understand the ceremony's significance without spoon-feeding interpretation. The film also features other extreme elements that shocked audiences. There's a scene where Morgan is forced to live like a dog, eating from the ground and sleeping outside. Women bathe Nissy in a river, shocking for a mainstream Western in 1970. Violence is sudden and brutal, with people killed by arrows or tomahawks in graphic detail. The film doesn't sanitize anything, treating Sioux life as complex and complete rather than simplified for white audiences. Critics were divided. Some praised the attempt at authenticity and Harris's committed performance. Others accused the film of exploitation, using Native culture as exotic backdrop for white savior narrative. Native activists had mixed reactions. Some appreciated the attempt at respectful portrayal. Others argued no amount of research justified a white actor playing it being Indian. The controversy helped the film financially, making over $13 million and spawning 2 sequels. But its extremity, particularly the Sundance sequence, ensured it remained controversial decades after release. Number 4. The Culpepper Cattle Co. Jaskers, 1972.
Thank you, Mr. Culpepper.
Why?
Because I want to be a cowboy.
Well, that's one hell of an ambition, boy.
Dick Richards directed this anti-romantic western about a teenage boy who joins a cattle drive, expecting adventure, and discovers nothing but misery, violence, and moral compromise. The Culpepper Cattle Co. was considered too extreme because it stripped away every glamorous element of cowboy life and showed it as backbreaking labor punctuated by sudden, ugly violence. This wasn't John Wayne riding heroically into the sunset. This was exhausted men covered in dirt and cow manure, killing when necessary, and feeling nothing about it afterward. Gary Grimes plays Ben Mockridge, a 16-year-old kid who talks his way onto a cattle drive thinking it'll be a romantic adventure. Within days, he realizes he's made a terrible mistake. The work is brutal and endless. He's constantly hungry, constantly exhausted, constantly terrified. The cowboys aren't noble heroes. They're rough men who treat him like an annoyance and mock his idealism. When violence erupts, it's quick and senseless. People die over petty disputes or accidents, and the drive just continues because the cattle still need moving. What made the film extreme was its commitment to deglamorizing everything. The cowboys don't wear clean clothes or have perfect teeth. They're filthy, unshaven, and several are missing fingers or have scars from previous injuries. The landscape isn't beautiful, it's harsh and oppressive. The cattle drive itself is shown in tedious detail, emphasizing how boring and miserable the work actually was. Hours of riding, more hours of standing guard, brief moments of terror when something goes wrong, then back to tedium. The violence shocked audiences because it happened without warning or buildup. A rustler gets shot in the face during an ambush, blood spraying everywhere. A cowboy falls off his horse and gets trampled, bones breaking audibly. Another character gets gut shot and dies slowly over several scenes, begging for morphine they don't have. There are no dramatic showdowns or heroic last stands. People just die, quickly and pointlessly, and everyone moves on because dwelling on death doesn't get the cattle to market. The film also shows moral compromise in ways westerns typically avoided. Ben participates in hangings without trial. He helps burn out homesteaders whose land the cattle drive needs to cross. He watches cowboys rape a woman and does nothing because he's too scared to intervene. By the end, he's become complicit in atrocities he would have condemned at the beginning. That transformation from innocent kid to hardened criminal happens gradually, almost invisibly, which makes it more disturbing than if he'd made one dramatic choice. Critics praised the film's realism and Grimes' performance, but audiences stayed away. The Culpepper Cattle Co. made barely over $2 million despite positive reviews. Nobody wanted to watch a western that made cowboy life look miserable and morally bankrupt. The film was too honest about what cattle drives actually involved, the exploitation and violence and grinding poverty that defined most cowboys' lives. Fox had marketed it as a traditional western, and audiences felt betrayed when they got something closer to documentary realism. The extremity wasn't in graphic content, but an absolute refusal to romanticize anything about the Old West. Number 3. Dirty Little Billy, 1972.
We could elect a mayor, we could elect a council, and we could hire a professional.
Stan Dragotti directed the most unglamorous Billy the Kid film ever made, showing him as a filthy, inarticulate psychopath rather than a romantic outlaw. Dirty Little Billy was considered too extreme because it took an American folk hero and revealed him as a mentally unstable color who never bathed, could barely string sentences together, and murdered people for incomprehensible reasons. The film is aggressively ugly, shot in muddy browns and grays, with characters covered in grime and living in squalor. It's the anti-Western, rejecting every convention to show frontier life as brutish and short. Michael J. Pollard plays Billy, and it's a remarkable performance of barely controlled chaos. This Billy isn't charming or quick-witted. He's slow, confused, possibly brain-damaged from childhood abuse. He mumbles and twitches. He calls impulsively without clear motivation. When he shoots someone, there's no dramatic buildup. He just pulls the trigger, often seeming surprised by his own actions. Pollard plays him as genuinely disturbed rather than romantically dangerous, and that choice made audiences deeply uncomfortable. The film follows Billy's early life in Kansas, living with his abusive stepfather and working in his saloon. The town is a nightmare of mud, filth, and casual violence. Nobody bathes, diseases spread unchecked. The saloon features gambling, prostitution, and regular fights that sometimes turn lethal. Billy exists on the periphery, marginalized and mocked until he starts calling. His first murder happens almost accidentally during a fight. The second is more deliberate. By the film's end, he's become the Billy the Kid of legend, but Dragoti shows it as mental illness rather than destiny. What made Dirty Little Billy extreme was its commitment to showing frontier towns as cesspools. The sets were built to look half-finished and falling apart. Actors weren't allowed to wash during filming, accumulating genuine dirt and grime. The cinematography used muddy colors and harsh lighting that made everything look diseased. One critic wrote that watching the film felt like contracting dysentery. That visceral unpleasantness was intentional. Dragoti wanted audiences to understand that frontier life was miserable for most people, especially the poor and marginalized. The film also dealt frankly with prostitution, violence against women, and the exploitation of Chinese immigrants. There are scenes in opium dens showing addiction's reality. A prostitute is beaten by customers and nobody intervenes because that's normal. Chinese workers are treated as subhuman and paid starvation wages. The film doesn't lecture about these injustices. It simply shows them as accepted parts of frontier capitalism, making the West's mythology seem even more absurd. Critics didn't know what to make of it. Some praised the revisionism and Pollard's fearless performance. Others found it unwatchable, too ugly and depressing to endure. Roger Ebert gave it 3 stars and called it deliberately, almost fanatically unpleasant. The film bombed spectacularly, making less than $1 million. Columbia had no idea how to market a Billy the Kid movie, where the protagonist was an unappealing psychopath covered in filth. Audiences expecting a traditional Western walked out. The extremity was in every frame, rejecting beauty, heroism, and meaning to show the West as a place where damaged people did terrible things, and everyone just accepted it because that's how things were. Number 2, Pat Garrett and Billy the Kid, 1973.
You take this.
Sam Peckinpah made his most personal Western and his most brutally violent outside the Wild Bunch. Pat Garrett and Billy the Kid was considered too extreme not just for graphic violence, but for its soul-crushing nihilism. This is a film about the death of everything, friendship, freedom, the Old West itself, and Peckinpah films it as a slow funeral march toward inevitable tragedy. The violence when it comes is quick, ugly, and pointless, people dying gut-shot or executed, while others watch helplessly. James Coburn plays Pat Garrett, the former outlaw turned lawman, hunting his old friend Billy the Kid, played by Chris Christopherson. The film makes clear from the opening that Garrett doesn't want to do this. He's been bought by the same wealthy interests destroying the frontier, turning free men into employees or corpses. Every step of the hunt is self-betrayal, and Coburn plays it with weary resignation. He's already dead inside. Killing Billy just makes it official. What made the film extreme was Peckinpah's refusal to give the violence any meaning or glory. When people get shot, they don't fall dramatically. They clutch their wounds and scream. There's a devastating sequence where a deputy gets gut shot during an ambush and spends several minutes dying, calling for his wife, begging for help that won't come. Another scene shows a man shot in the throat, blood pumping out while he drowns. Peckinpah holds on to these deaths, forcing audiences to witness the full horror of gunshot wounds. What's most extreme about Pat Garrett is its autobiographical subtext. Peckinpah was being pushed out of Hollywood, his drinking and difficult behavior making him unemployable. The film is about a man forced to destroy what he loves to survive in a world he no longer recognizes. When Garrett shoots Billy at the end, it feels like Peckinpah culling his own past and everything he believed in. That combination of graphic violence and spiritual death made Pat Garrett too extreme for audiences who wanted entertainment, not witnessing a filmmaker's self-destruction captured on film. Number 1, The Wild Bunch, 1969. Sam Peckinpah revolutionized action cinema and created the most controversial Western of the decade. The Wild Bunch wasn't just considered extreme, it was called fascist, pornographic, and morally bankrupt by critics who couldn't process what Peckinpah had done. He took the traditional Western shootout and transformed it into something completely new, using slow motion, rapid editing, and graphic violence to create sequences that were simultaneously beautiful and horrifying. The film's body count exceeds 200, and the blood flows so freely that theaters reported audiences getting physically ill. The film follows aging outlaws in 1913 Mexico, men who've outlived their era. William Holden leads the bunch as Pike Bishop, a professional thief watching the world change around him. They attempt one last score, get betrayed, and end up working for a Mexican general. When the general tortures one of their own, the bunch decides to rescue him, knowing they won't survive. What follows is 5 minutes of sustained carnage that changed action filmmaking forever. What made The Wild Bunch extreme wasn't just the volume of violence, but how Peckinpah filmed it. He used multiple cameras running at different speeds, from 24 frames per second to 120. In editing, he cuts between these speeds, creating a rhythm where violence happens in slow motion, then suddenly accelerates to real time, then slows again. The effect is hypnotic and disturbing. You can't look away, but you're also appalled by what you're watching. Bodies explode when hit by machine gun fire. Blood sprays in slow motion arcs. Men convulse and scream as bullets tear through them. Theater owners sued Warner Brothers, claiming the film would cause riots. The MPAA nearly gave it an X rating. Critics were violently divided. Some called it a masterpiece. Others, including Pauline Kael initially, condemned it as fascist. Roger Ebert wrote he wasn't sure if it was good, but knew it was important. The audience were shocked, but couldn't stop talking about it. The Wild Bunch made over $10 million, becoming a hit despite the controversy. What made it most extreme was Peckinpah's refusal to condemn the violence while also refusing to glorify it. The bunch are colors, but they're also men with a code trying to maintain dignity in a world that no longer values them. Their final stand is both heroic and completely stupid. They die for nothing that matters, but they die on their terms. That moral ambiguity, combined with the most graphic violence American audiences had seen, made The Wild Bunch too extreme for many viewers. But it also changed cinema forever, proving that action could be art and violence could have meaning beyond simple good versus evil. The 1970s forced Westerns to grow up, showing the frontier as it actually was rather than how mythology pretended. These 10 films pushed boundaries so hard that audiences rejected them, but they paved the way for every revisionist Western that followed. They were too extreme for their time, but history has proven them right.